welcome back behind the velvet rope. Let's just get right into it today because we are joined by the one, the only Mr. Tyler Henry.
Hello, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for being here. How are you doing today? You're in Malibu, LA area?
Nope, Hollywood Hills now. I'm jumping all over the place, but it's been great and I'm a medium in transit.
I love it. Well, listen, first of all, congratulations on this new series, Life After Death with Tyler Henry. It is trending on the top of the Netflix charts. It premiered on March 11th. So here's the thing. I'm a professional, Tyler. So when I knew I was going to sit down with you, I figured, I would watch an episode, maybe an episode and a half. Let me tell you something. All 9 episodes are out. I could not walk away from my TV. I was drawn into this.
I'm so glad. They definitely got the cliffhangers right.
It is such a good show. So listen, I want to talk all about this new show on Netflix, but I've seen you live in your live shows. I've watched you on Hollywood Medium. So I know the answers to a lot of these questions, but for everyone listening who wants to check out this show, let's just get to know you a little bit more for a few minutes before we talk about this new show.
Perfect.
So let's go back to when you were young. When did you first realize that you had this gift?
So my first conscious moment of having this ability was actually when I was 10 years old. And it happened in the strangest way. It was April of 2006. And I woke up one night and I just had this knowingness that my grandmother was going to die. And I called it a knowingness because at the time it really felt like a memory that hadn't happened yet. It was very clear, I could recollect it, but it hadn't occurred. And so it was very confusing. And I went into the room to try to explain this to my mom and was really upset. And as I was explaining this to her, we were interrupted by her phone ringing. And so she paused and we took a beat and she picked up the phone. And it was actually the news from my dad in that moment that my grandmother had just died. So while my mom was technically receiving the news for the first time, I felt like I was kind of processing it for the second. And it really changed my grief process as I moved forward, even at 10 years old.
Well, yeah, I would imagine that it would. I mean, and then what was that like? Were you like, okay, this was a premonition, this is strange? Or, I mean, did you realize like this is something bigger right away at that point? Because I could imagine a lot of different things going through your mind.
Sure. At 10 years old, you don't even have a clear understanding of your identity. So it was more something that happened to me. And then as it would happen again and again and again, and I would get these moments of knowingness at school as I would interact with kids and teachers, I found that it was something that could be considered more of an ability. But by the time I was 13, I realized this wasn't going away. This was part of who I was. And at that age, I started trying to exert a little bit more control over it, which was really a predecessor to the readings that you see today.
So from having this premonition at 10 with your grandmother and then to 13, like when in this process do you then decide to tell your parents? I imagine they're the first people you told.
Sure. Well, my mom was obviously the first one to hear about the premonition, but my dad actually was kept in the dark. At 16 years old, when I finally had the courage to work professionally as a medium, I graduated high school early. I enrolled in college to try to become a hospice nurse. I was the youngest in my class. But while I was doing that, I was also doing readings on the side. And being that I grew up in a small town, my mom said that I needed to get permission from my dad. So I kind of had to come out of that psychic closet at 16 years old and share with my dad that I was a medium. And not only that, but that I had gotten a premonition about his own mother's death shortly before it happened. So that was a game changer for sure.
And what was your father's reaction to that?
He didn't even understand what a medium was, but it took time and he ultimately found different ways to kind of test me, to get an understanding of how it worked, one of which involved him actually giving me a yearbook of his and having me go through it and seeing if I got any psychic impressions about any classmates of his. And I was actually successfully able to point to a number of classmates of his who had died. And he knew there's no way I could know that. So there were little kind of tests and as partly just ways of trying to get an understanding of how it works, if it can be done from a distance, if I need somebody in person. So once my dad understood, he became one of my biggest supporters.
Wow. Yeah, I imagine if you're going through the yearbook and you're pointing out to people that he knows and you're telling him things about them, that's kind of a foolproof method there.
Exactly. It was like a sixth sense moment.
That's what about, I mean, you're 10 to 13, like what were your emotions going through this? Like, were you scared at first? Like, were you confused?
When it comes to scary things, seeing frightening things, I think people think of mediums as kind of living in a world of constant scariness. I would say that really the only time I dealt with much difficulty in that regard was between the ages of 10 and 13. I would get very strong impressions around the kids that I was at school with, and very often would get insight into maybe arguments that their parents were having or personal life issues they were going through. And I would share these almost casually because they felt like memories that were similar to my own, and people would validate them as being correct. So I dealt with a lot of fear. A lot of people were quite frightened with how I was able to do what I do. We talk about skeptics in kind of a modern incarnation, but back then I didn't really deal with skepticism as much as I dealt with people being very unsure of how I was able to do this and what that meant.
Were people's parents like, okay, that's the child to stay away from? I mean, I make a joke of it. It's such a gift, but
It fell into two camps. So in one camp, I had a close friend that I shared with this ability, and she told her mother, and her mother was a religious fundamentalist whose church I had attended. And she had a whole prayer circle for my soul with a group of her friends. And I discovered that at a very early age. And it was very painful to hear that at a time when I was still trying to figure out who I was and what I was, that people felt the need to pray for my existence as a child. Equally, though, I dealt with some people who were interested, who were open-minded, parents who would hear what I said and would want to meet with me after school. So it definitely fell into two camps, as it still does today.
absolutely. Like in a way, you were maybe the ostracized child or the most popular child on the playground.
Exactly. And I think there's something to be said about the very things I was bullied for kind of became the things I'm applauded for now as an adult. So it speaks to the importance of just being true to who you are.
Absolutely. Did you ever think of, like you have this ability, did you ever go down that road of like you graduated early of, hey, I want to be a fireman, a teacher, an accountant? Like, did you ever think of doing anything else with your life once you realized you had this gift?
Well, I definitely felt that hospice nursing would be the most practical application of what I could do. It meant that I would still be able to share my ability, but not in the public sense. I saw certain difficulties that came with being public medium, what that meant, what that entailed. And I didn't think I was ready for that, being that I'm a very private, very introverted, very non-Hollywood kind of person. But after the dean of my college encouraged me to pursue readings, one thing led to another. And I think when the dean of your school is telling you, hey, you should consider this career path, I took it as a sign that maybe it was good to go in a different direction.
Absolutely. Were you, when you were a hospice nurse, just because, like I've had people in my family, like in hospice, it's like, did that kind of cross over in a sense of like, it is a different job?
Sure. Well, I never graduated school as a hospice nurse, but I went to school with the goal of trying to become one. And so in that, we were immersed with professors and other students who had sometimes family who worked in hospice. And it was amazing to hear how